couple of weeks ago, I did a podcast on Quinn Ewers and Arch Manning and Steve Sarkisian and the state of the quarterback situation at the University of Texas. In that show, which was the week of the Oklahoma game, I stated that Quinn Ewers is QB1 and will be QB1. I listed the reasons why Sarkisian is going to do this. I also listed the reasons why, or the problems that it would cause if they started to mess around between Ewers and Manning. And now it's 2 games later, Oklahoma and Georgia. And the Longhorns may have a big issue at the quarterback position. This is QB Unfiltered, my take. It may be decision time in Austin, Texas.
I don't ever slow up, no I don't take shit. I got no love for the fakeness. If you wanna play tough and wanna hate this, I'll always show up and make a statement.
Okay, now this podcast is going to focus a little bit on the Texas-Georgia game that was played this last Saturday. But really, it's a 2-week deep dive into the topic of Quinn Ewers, Arch Manning, and Steve Sarkisian. I had a show planned after the Oklahoma game, and that was a game that was a little bit of it was interesting. Texas was definitely not humming on all cylinders offensively. You know, they had their second quarter of that game where they basically scored some real fast touchdowns, but they weren't the typical Texas Longhorn offense in that game. I shelved that podcast because I wanted to see how Quinn was going to play the following game against Georgia. So here's the breakdown on my thought process on this. He gets hurt. He misses 2 full games. During that time where he didn't play in the games, he wasn't practicing, right? Or if he was, it was very, very limited, but probably didn't do anything in regards to live pocket, drill work, team, 11 on 11, blitz pickup, those sorts of situations. And with a quarterback, you have to stay in the groove to keep your rhythm, to keep your timing, to keep your tempo, to keep your thought process. And when you sit out a couple of weeks, it sort of knocks you back a little bit and you got to get back into the groove. And that's why I shelved my podcast after the Oklahoma game. I said, okay, he had a week to practice leading up to the Oklahoma game. He had the live, reps against the Sooners. Now I'm going to give him another week of practice preparation and live reps against Georgia before we actually talk about the quarterback situation. So that's where we're at right now. My thoughts on Quinn Ewers after the Oklahoma game were these. I thought he looked indecisive. Even when he was completing balls, I'm talking about the passing game now, obviously, even when he was completing balls, he looked just a tick slow and indecisive on pulling the trigger, actually throwing the rock, or going to his next read or going to his check down. It just was a little bit off. And then his throwing in that game, he misfired on some early throws. He just looked like he may be still suffering some problems with the abdominal strain, the oblique strain that he had. And I'm going to talk about that more in a bit when we talk about the Georgia game. But he threw a lot of soft footballs in this game on throws where they should have been ropes. I call it throwing a 1, putting a lot of juice behind the throw, fitting it into receivers, and he was throwing the ball soft. It was soft. Overall, against Oklahoma, he just looked uncomfortable to me on the field. Now, I've said this in other shows. I'm really in tune with watching QBs, their body language, facial expressions, just the aura around them in a game. And so I'm watching him on the field. They've got close-ups of him, while he's out there with the offense on the field. And then they had a lot of shots of him on the sideline, sitting on the bench. and I was observing him. And, the thing that I came away with in the Oklahoma game was he kept his poise. He kept his cool. There was no panic. There was no frustration, which is such a great skill for your starting quarterback to have, because the rest of your teammates, feed off of that stuff, and they take a lot of their attitude towards what is going on in the game based on how their quarterback is handling situations, whether it's adversity or it's success. Okay, so I was expecting some pretty significant improvements going into the Georgia game. This is, like I said earlier, 2 weeks of practice now, a full game under his belt against the Sooners. But in watching him against the Bulldogs, he looked pretty much the same. Indecision in the passing game, some really poor decisions on where to throw the ball. And I'll talk about one of those in particular, which really blew my mind. But most glaring to me was how he threw the football. Soft throws again. Now, Quinn doesn't have the world's strongest arm, but there's no way against Oklahoma and against Georgia did he look like the quarterback that we saw earlier in the season or that we saw last year. Soft footballs. And I call it aiming the ball, okay, where he's trying to he's guiding the football. He's aiming it, and you can't do that as a quarterback. On the throws that require you to put some juice behind it, you got to snap those throws off, get on top of your throw, and drill it. Now, one of the telltale signs of a quarterback guiding or aiming the football is throwing balls behind the receiver. And he threw passes that were behind his guys. And that's just not like him. So that was pretty glaring to me. And he really looked like he was trying to be way too careful when he threw the football. Now that again goes to indecisions mentally. And at the end of the day, that is not a great combination. Indecisions, throwing soft footballs when you throw the ball as a big part of your offense. Now, as we got closer to halftime, I started to think that Sarkisian may give Arch Manning some snaps just to calm Quinn Ewers down, and that's exactly what he did. I assumed it would be in the second half. I thought that Sark would let Quinn go in at halftime, collect himself a little bit, tap his helmet, and then come out and see what he's got going in the second half. But he did it at the end of the first half, the last two drives. And at halftime, I got on X and I tweeted out that it's going to be interesting to see what Steve Sarkisian does in the second half, because whichever decision he makes with his quarterbacks, it's going to have an effect on Quinn Ewers one way or the other. All right. And you could do a whole show on the psychological makeup of quarterbacks. And it's a tricky situation. This is really a tightrope that a coach like Sarkisian now is walking. There are a lot of factors and variables that go into what he's going to do with his quarterbacks. And I'm going to touch on some of those as we go. I touched on some of those in my show 2 weeks ago. This is one of the reasons why Sarkisian gets paid the big bucks, is he's got to make the right call on this, because it's going to have an effect on Texas moving forward. And Steve Sarkisian came out in the third quarter and made exactly the right decision. He put Quinn back in the game, said he's our guy, and they went. Now, what did I think of Arch Manning in his two series against Georgia? Well, in his decision-making and his throwing the rock, he looked more confident than Quinn Ewers, to me. All right? I can tell when I watch a quarterback play, whether it's Quinn Ewers, Arch Manning, or anybody, there's just a way that they drop, move during their drop. the timing of sticking that back foot in the ground, striding and getting the ball out and throwing it with confidence, you can just tell. All right. You can tell there's a difference. What I also feel about Arch Manning is I'm sure that in his mind, and it sort of showed a little bit on his face out there, in his mind, he was going, holy shit. These dudes for Georgia on defense, they are fast. Not like high school, not like playing, the 2 games I played before when Quinn was hurt. These dudes can play. And so, I'm sure that was going through his mind as he dropped back to pass, and it got a lot faster in his environment when he was doing that. But I thought that he came in and did a decent job, and he's going to be a hell of a quarterback. There's going to be some growing pains. When you're talking about playing against teams like Georgia, there's going to be some growing pains, but experience is the greatest teacher for a quarterback. Game reps against great competition. And so I talked about in my show 2 weeks ago that Sarkisian's going to play Ewers as his starter, but he's got to get Manning reps in games because there's nothing that replicates game reps. Now, he didn't do that against Oklahoma. I was kind of surprised in the fourth quarter when they had the game won that he didn't put Arch in there and let him do some things. But the fact that he got 2 series in against the Georgia Bulldogs, that just, that he just banks that in the experience file, and that's really going to help him out down the road. Okay, so after the Georgia game, there's 2 things, in my opinion, that's going on here with Quinn Ewers. Either his abdominal injury, he had an abdominal or an oblique strain, is still causing him problems. And your abs, your core, your midsection is so important in throwing the football. And if you have pain or you have restriction in getting that rotation of your trunk and just the cutting the ball loose and the, what it does to your midsection, if you're having issues with that, that may be why we're seeing him throw soft passes. Okay, so that's number 1. Or number 2, and we got to say it, he may have the yips. He may have the yips. And another way of saying that is he may have lost his confidence a little bit. And the looks, the aura, the projection that he gave on the sideline of the Oklahoma game was a little bit different than it was in the Georgia game. In the Georgia game, I just saw a different look on his face. And so one of those 2 things is going on. But whichever it is, the bottom line is Texas's offense is sputtering right now. And of course, they were brutal against Georgia, and the Bulldogs had a hell of a lot to do with that. Defensively, those guys, a lot of people on Twitter were talking about how they got manhandled, how they manhandled Texas's offensive line and how physical they were. The biggest difference in that game, Georgia's speed on defense. At every position, their speed. Okay, now speaking of body language, I was disappointed in Georgia quarterback Carson Beck. And he didn't have the world's greatest game. It was very uneven. He threw picks, and there were times where adversity hit and he dropped his head, shook his head, had a look on his face like, oh, geez. And guys, I'm telling you, this is 100% correct. Whether things are going good or they're going poorly, your QB cannot show either way too much elation and relaxation or going in the tank when adversity hits. Got to keep that even keel. You got to keep competing. And so I was a little surprised that I saw Beck do that, but he did do that. And, that's something that he needs to really work on. Now, here comes the tricky part for Steve Sarkisian this week. Okay, they're playing Vanderbilt. He knows that he can't have a QB controversy. All right. And how you have that is when you start playing musical chairs with your quarterbacks. Quinn goes in. If he's not getting it done, he puts Arch in. If Arch isn't getting it done, he puts Quinn back in. That is a bad scenario. Sarkisian knows that. All right. So he's either going to have to go with Quinn Ewers and just say, we got to work through this. We got to work through this. And he's got to get back on his game because Texas is still in the playoff hunt. They are still in it. And so they still have to win football games. All right. So either goes with Quinn or he makes the move to Arch Manning, and that's that. That's that. And if he does that, that's going to be very seismic in Austin, in the locker room, the fan base, the football team, everything. And so it's going to be interesting to see what he does. What is the lesser of two evils there with his decision? I don't know. I do know this. Texas's offense is out of sync and they got to get back in the groove. Okay. Some thoughts on the Texas-Georgia game. Now, these are random thoughts. All right. Random thoughts. Number one, when you're throwing an outside vertical to a track star, in this case, Texas's Ryan Wingo, as a quarterback, you cannot take a hitch step or you can't be late getting the ball out. Okay. Because with quarterbacks, I never taught a hitch step on an outside vertical because when you hitch step, you can add up to 10 yards more that the receiver's further downfield, that ball's got to travel. And when you got a guy like Wingo who can fly, if you hitch step or get the ball out late, you're going to underthrow the ball. And that's exactly what happened Saturday night against Georgia. Okay, if you want to know what an absolute perfect pair of bookend offensive tackles look like, look at Texas's two guys. Wow. Those guys look the part. They're damn good. They had their hands full, obviously, with Georgia's speed, but holy shit, those guys looked really good. Okay, now this play right here. You want to know how to totally screw up a pass concept? Check this out. This is the interception that Quinn Ewers threw where the corner stepped in front of an option route and picked the ball off. Now, I've got film here. This film is awesome because this shows you exactly what I'm talking about here. This end zone shot that I'm going to show you. What Texas is running is an option route. Okay. They've got I think it's their tight end that's flexed out outside receiver to the right. And the slot receiver is running an option route. Now, when I ran this and we ran this to death, this was a staple of my pass offense, was running the option route. Because if your receivers run it right, it doesn't matter whether it's man or zone. It's very, very difficult to stop unless you do what Texas did on this play. So Georgia's sitting in two zone, and in two zone, the cornerbacks are going to keep outside leverage. So they're either going to line up a little bit outside shade of that outside receiver, or on the snap of the ball, they're going to step outside. And what they want to do is they want to funnel the receiver inside, because if he goes vertical, they're funneling him into that safety coming off the hash. When you're running this option route, this outside receiver has to take an outside release. MOR, mandatory outside release. Because if he outside releases, that cornerback is going to widen with him to keep his outside leverage. And you keep widening as an outside receiver, and it keeps widening that corner. And look at all the grass that you create for your option receiver. Texas's outside receiver takes an inside freaking release and the corner squeezes down. And now you've got that option route bracketed. And then Quinn, and this is one of the bad decisions he made, throws the ball and it's picked. And, it's hard for me to believe that Sarkisian would give his outside receiver a two-way go on their release, where he would just say, take your best release to get vertical. I got to believe that this is a mental bust by that outside receiver that he did not force the outside release. Either way, this is a bad play for Texas. And when you do stuff like this in your passing game, that's one reason why you've got like 38 yards of total offense in the first half. Okay, what happened when Arch Manning came in the game? Last two series of the first half, he started getting offensive linemen flinching for illegal procedure penalties. Now, you as a coach, you are always, as a quarterback coach, you are always in your QB's ear, your backup, your number 3 guy, that they have to mimic the tempo and the rhythm that the starter has in his cadence. Right? Because if they don't, you're going to have offensive linemen flinching. You're going to have receivers probably flinching. Now, I know that they work on this, but I'll also guarantee you that when Arch Manning went in the game against the Georgia Bulldog defensive speed, his blood pressure may have been a little elevated, and he probably sped up his cadence count, and now you got guys flinching. Longhorns' first touchdown was really sweet. Sarkisian dicked with Georgia with motion, and what happened was he out-leveraged and was able to throw that shoot route. And they also had a little intentional, unintentional pick/rub by a receiver, but that was a good design. Another great play and great call by Sark was the touchdown pass they threw versus man coverage to the running back on an angle route. Offenses that throw the football, if you've got a running back that can not only run it, but has good receiving skills, man, you got the defense screwed, because they can't account for running backs in the passing game. But when you go man to man and you have an inside linebacker on a better athlete who's a running back, and your running back can run good routes and catch the rock, you get a situation like we got here where the back runs this little angle route, gets inside that inside backer, Quinn puts it right on him, touchdown. Okay, if you noticed in this game, Georgia's defensive line in unison doing a full stem right before the ball was snapped. And they're doing that to screw up Texas's run blocks or pass protection scheme, right? Now, this tells me one thing. They were able to do this in unison and right before Texas snapped the ball. That tells me that the Longhorns weren't mixing up the snap count and that they were primarily going with one tempo and rhythm with the cadence. And Georgia got that down and they were able to time that out. So what needs to happen with that, with any offense, any OC, one way to alleviate or eliminate that, or stemming in the secondary, coverages, is to go either quick count or to go freeze count. So you got whatever play you got called and you get up to the line of scrimmage and Quinn just goes, go, and you snap the ball. That gets Georgia's defensive coordinator out of that stemming stuff immediately. Or set, go, and nobody moves. It's a freeze count. And now they've shown what they're going to do. And then you just go back in and start your cadence over again and you run the play. And they've already lined up where they're going to be. Right? So that's, that was one thing that I noticed in this game. Okay. As I said earlier, the Horns are still very much in the playoff picture. This is going to be an interesting week in Austin, and Steve Sarkisian has a huge decision to make. All right. If you enjoyed today's show, hit that like button, please. That really helps me out. Continue to pass the word out there. Subscribe to the channel QB Unfiltered. Let me know in the comments what you think of the quarterback situation. What were your thoughts on the Georgia game? And what do you see happening in the Vandy game coming up? All right, this is QB Unfiltered. And remember, always throw the ball short to guys who can score. See ya.
I got no love for the fakeness. If you wanna play tough and wanna hate this, I'll always show up.